This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode 319 of the Craft Beer Brewing Podcast. I'm in Boulder, Colorado, not too far, about an hour away from my home in Fort Collins, at a brewery that actually plays a small part in the historical story of craft beer and brewing. Joining me here is Alex Meyer, head brewer of Upslope Brewing. Welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Thanks, Jamie. Appreciate it.
The very earliest days of craft beer and brewing, my business partner, John Bolton, lived down here in Boulder, a neighborhood right around the corner from this Lee Hill tap room that we're in now, the original brewery and tap room for Upslope. And, I have some fond memories of concocting the idea for our business while sitting in this tap room and having some conversations with John about it. And so it's kind of fun now, 10 years after we really 10 years to the month. It's September now, and that was the month that we incorporated exactly 10 years ago, incorporated Unfiltered Media to publish Craft Beer and Brewing. And so here we are 10 years later at one of the spots where we were engaged in those early conversations. Not that I'm getting nostalgic. Maybe I am. Anyway, thanks for joining me. If I think about Upslope, I think about craft lager. Yeah, this was Upslope was one of these was one of the very few breweries that 10 years ago, as we were planning this, that was making and putting a lot of weight behind craft lager, carving out a space for that when a lot of other craft brewers were going in a completely different direction. Of course, as recently as 2019, you won a silver medal at GBF for that same craft lager. It's still going strong in the International Pilsner category. Still going strong. You all are making lots more lagers now. We're drinking a Japanese style rice lager right now. Yep. You all send plenty our way in that lager space. You guys are experimenting there. Of course, surrounding us here in the Lee Hill brewery are a bunch of the special projects, the one-off beers, the barrel-aged beers, the wild and sour beers, some of the more interesting projects that you all engage in. We're going to talk about that. And then, you also make some hard seltzers that are pretty damn good. So I don't know, maybe we'll talk about hard seltzers. I don't know. Maybe we won't. We'll see where the conversation goes.
Yeah. Sounds good.
We're going to talk about all of these things over the course of this episode. But first, G&D Chillers, the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling, are proud of the cool partnerships they've built over the past 30 years. G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, and reliability with 24/7 service and support. Want to maximize efficiency in your chiller? G&D's micro-channel condensers are designed for less power draw. Their lighter weight and more compact design uses up to 70% less refrigerant, which means a lower GWP and lower operating costs. Reach out for a quote today at gdchillers.com or call to discuss your next project. Also, this episode is sponsored by BSG, distributors of Gambrinus Malting, Canada's original small batch artisanal malt house. Located in Armstrong, BC, Gambrinus Malting combines European-influenced malting practices with the finest barley, wheat, and rye to produce some of the finest Canadian malts available. Visit bsgcraftbrewing.com/Gambrinus to explore their full line of traditionally crafted malts and infuse your next brew with the character of the Okanagan Valley and Monashee Range. And is your brewery making its own ciders, seltzers, and other beverages beyond beer? If you need a central source for fruit flavor, Old Orchard has you covered. Old Orchard supplies flavored craft juice concentrate blends to beverage brands for the production of beer, cider, seltzer, wine, spirits, kombucha, and more. Flavor your lineup and streamline your sourcing by heading to oldorchard.com/brewer. So, Alex, let's start off with a little bit of history. What's your history look like in brewing? And then we can talk a little bit about Upslope's history now, which dates back. It's 14-ish.
We're coming up on
15 years. Yeah.
Yep. So I started in the industry about 10 years ago. I was going to CU Boulder, studied mechanical engineering there. Was looking for jobs in the traditional fields there and not really enjoying it, but got really into beer while I was in Boulder.
It happens.
Yep. And got a job at Upslope on the packaging side. So that's, pretty directly in line with mechanical stuff there. But it still had a passion for making beer and eventually made that switch over to the brewing side. Shift brewing over there. And then coming back to Lee Hill. When I say over there, that's Flatiron Park, our production facility that was opened about 10 years ago. But yeah, came back to Lee Hill, started doing more of that R&D kind of barrel age stuff, all that fun stuff you get to do. And then
those beers that always get sent to me in like stovepipe cans around the holidays. Yes.
Yep. And then about 2 years ago, moving back primarily to Flatiron Park in the head brewer role. So I've, done a lot of different sides.
Full brewing career here at Upslope.
Yeah. So I've been here for about a decade now.
Yeah.
Definitely learned a lot.
It's somewhat unusual in the brewing world.
Yep. So, kind of growing with the craft beer industry as well. And, Upslope was about 5 years old and had just opened the new facility when I started on. So it was kind of that upward trajectory in, 2013, 2014, and seeing the market mature a lot and,
sure.
Having to innovate. So that was part of the fun of coming back here and doing the R&D stuff. But, that's kind of my role at Upslope, just, learning a lot about each side of production.
When the founders of Upslope started the brewery, what was the kind of broad goal and vision as it's been communicated to you and all the teams here at Upslope?
Yeah, I mean, that was like 15 years ago. So 2008, kind of a tough time out there, right? We're in the Great Recession. They're looking to make, a craft brewery that makes approachable beers. We're very like outdoor oriented around here. So something that you're going to have after your mountain bike ride or, climbing, whatever that is. So really approachable beers that you don't have to think too much about if you don't want to. But then there's the other side of it where we're still experimenting and we're making new beers all the time. At Lee Hill, we put out probably close to 100 different beers a year. So, working on different barrel age projects or a new lager that's coming down the pipeline, IPAs, whatever it is. So I think the vision for Upslope was to, make good beer that you could take with you outside, but also continue to innovate and stay relevant. So,
talk to me about. Let's talk kick things off talking about craft lager.
Sure.
I'm curious about that. Because craft lager and literally the beer is just called craft lager.
Yeah.
Because that's such a linchpin now. For Upslope, what was as you obviously you were here when the beer was developed, but I imagine that story and the lore has been passed down, and of course you've been tasked with maintaining that beer. What was the idea behind it? What how do you want it to convey now? And what are some of the general parameters and ideas behind the beer?
Yeah, exactly. I mentioned one of the founders from Argentina. His name's Danny Page. He's still here. Obviously, he's my boss. And he developed that as the first head brewer at Upslope. I think he has the unique position of being from another country outside of this market and being like, why wouldn't we do this? Where, at the time, a lot of craft brewers were shying away from making lagers because it was kind of what the macro brewers are doing and they were rejecting that.
Sure.
But he was like, a lot of people like this style. We're going to make our own. And, using some kind of new methods for making lagers. I have deep respect for traditional lager methods, and we still do a lot of lagers that way, especially on a smaller scale. But it was trying to figure out a way that we could make these beers pretty quickly, especially when we're growing a lot and do not have the tank residency times that you would traditionally need. So I think the idea was just trying to make a really approachable beer that, even if you weren't a craft beer drinker, you might still be into that. And I think a lot of people really appreciated that with craft lager. And as it's kind of grown over the years, it's, like I said, I don't think craft lager is trying to be the triple decocted Pilsner of the world. It's trying to fill a space that's easy drinking and you want to take it fly fishing. It's just an easy beer that's consistent. And I think, people really appreciate that. We're still doing traditional beers. I love all of that, but trying to find a way to make a beer that it's our best selling beer. So, how can we make a lot of it? We leave it in the tank for months at a time. So it's always been about, I think, just making something. It's funny that it's now maybe the status quo, but it kind of went against the grain a little bit initially, and people sort of shunned it. But I think sticking to that has proven very fruitful.
What are some of the parameters around it? You know, it's not the palest of lagers.
No.
It's not the crispest of lagers.
Yeah.
That's not its goal. But, you know, I mean, obviously it's well structured. It has a balanced flavor.
Mm-hmm.
It's not meant to be, you know, I wouldn't describe it as either German or Czech. It is definitely kind of its own, you know, approach to lager beer.
Sure.
Are there some kind of broad parameters that you can share around it? And in terms of, you know, where you all find some of, you know, because obviously we're dealing with, you know, a lager here. You've got a small number of levers that you can pull relative to, you know, malt choice, hop choice, and then some, you know, basic fermentation and gravity choices to create the kind of, you know, feel and flavor that you're looking for in the beer.
Yeah.
You know, how do you go about that? And what are some, you know, what are some of the decisions that are made in that beer, you know, that help accomplish, you know, some of the design goals?
Yeah. I mean, it's going to have a lean malt body to it, but we're not adding adjuncts like rice or corn to it to really lighten it up. So you're really just leaning on some pale two-row, right? And then
two-row and not Pilsner malt.
Two-row and not Pilsner malt.
Huh. Why that?
Well, you know, some of it has to do with the feasibility of getting bulk malt. And, you know, if you did all Pilsner, then you've got that in all your beers.
Right.
I think another thing from my perspective, if I was going to steer it in another direction, I would probably still keep it at two-row, is that, you know, when we're up here at elevation, you have a really pale base malt like that, you're going to have a bit more DMS unless you can boil that for a long time. And like I said, we got to make a lot of this. So, you know, it's funny to call it kind of industrialized, but it's fit for that. I think you get a little more complexity from single infusion mashing that way too. Mm-hmm. You know, if we were decocting or doing some other methods with like a really nice Pilsner malt, sure, that'd be awesome. Another thing I've, you know, been really tasked with as a head brewer is like, it's great to use all of the best malts that you want, but you know, it might not be cost effective. So it's a balance of everything, right? It's like making the best beer you can that's still worth making from a sales standpoint.
Being able to deliver it to consumers at a price point that they can afford and buy often is also, I mean, it is an important piece of this too, you know. And,
you know, like I said earlier, I definitely respect the, like, I'm going to make this beer as awesome as I can with all the choicest malts and everything. And we do that. But for this beer, it's like, you know, let's consider all these parameters here. And then, you know, just so keeping it really lean there without adjuncts. So it's all malt. But then, you know, the hop choice is pretty crucial too, because we're really just hitting it with a Whirlpool edition. So it's not heavy handed. You know, we're not getting to the level of like a German Pilsner or even an Italian Pilsner that's dry hopped or something like that. But, you know, we have a sizable addition, the Whirlpool, to have some hop expression there.
Why the Whirlpool and not, you know, earlier on in the process? I
think it's just, you know, some of this has been like how it's always been made. But I continue to use that method mainly because, like, you know, we're at the point where...
you could argue that you can hit similar bitterness numbers, and because it's a lager, you're not...
Yeah.
Your goal isn't necessarily a lot of aroma either.
Yeah. I think that's just the way that we like that hot side character to come through. You know, there's a lot of lagers where I'll do like a 40-minute edition and something like that. But this one, we're using like an alpha extract for most bitterness and then hitting it with some nice hops in the Whirlpool. That was originally some Czech Saaz. Nowadays, we've moved away from that. And a lot of that was a conscious decision with declining quality we were seeing wanting to save our Czech Saaz for the Czech Pilsners we were making and stuff. So we're actually using a Sterling hop, which is grown in Oregon. And that's very similar to some of those noble varieties, but we're seeing the quality is a lot better because it's not, you know, shipped across the ocean in a compacted bale. It's a lot fresher.
Yeah.
So we've switched to Sterling and really like that change. But yeah, then other than that, it's just, you know, as clean a yeast profile as you can get. There's some intricacies.
Is there an IBU goal for this, or?
You know, if I had to guess, it's probably about 15 or something like that. So it's pretty low. But that kind of, I'm sure that fluctuates with the different alpha acids we're getting in those Sterlings.
And then of course doing it through the whirlpool, it's it's probably lending that softer, less isomerized bitterness, a little less of that cooktop character.
And IBU will only tell you so much, right? So it's kind of like if we're tasting, that's why sensory is really important. If we're tasting an increased bitterness, the IBUs might be showing the same thing, but it's like, okay, let's back off a little bit. But yeah, it's just, and there's some parts of the fermentation character that are characteristic to that yeast. So I would say just overall, it should be, like you said, it's not too light, but it's still pretty balanced and easy drinking. Those hops aren't hitting you over the head, but it's just nice and easy. There's a little white wheat in there. I forgot to say that. That gives it, that helps a little with the
add some
foam
body,
stability and some body. Yeah, but otherwise, like it's really a very simple beer, and that's where it comes down to like making it all the time and getting.
Is it malted wheat or unmalted?
It's malted wheat. Okay. Yeah. Yep.
Well, I'm going to talk about fermentation. Obviously, like a high sulfur character is not necessarily the goal in this either. I'm curious how you manage that with all of this, two-road add this kind of softer lager character. Before we do that, AccuBrew now monitors specific gravity to ensure consistent results and detect problems before they ruin a batch. The AccuBrew system is designed to give you unprecedented insight into the fermentation process, monitor gravity, fermentation activity, clarity, and temperature, schedule reminders, and receive alerts anywhere, anytime. AccuBrew's CIP-ready device is designed to stay out of your way. They know your time and space is precious, and they take up as little of both as possible. No more samples, no cleaning, and no calibration. Set it and forget it. To learn more about AccuBrew, head on over to accubrew.io. Also, ProBrew is excited to announce that they're currently featuring short lead times between 2 and 4 weeks for their in-stock ProFill rotary can fillers. These can fillers run at speeds between 100 and 600 plus cans per minute, while achieving precise and consistent filling volumes not achievable by most inline and mobile fillers. For more information, fill out their contact form on www.probrew.com or email contactus@probrew.com to learn exactly how they can take your operations to the next level. ProBrew, brew your beer. And elevate your brewing game with RMS Roller Grinder. Their industry-leading mills deliver optimal grind consistency, unlocking the full potential of your grain. Say goodbye to uneven grinds and hello to exceptional flavor extraction. Brewpub or production facility, RMS has the expertise and grain handling equipment to meet your needs. Visit rmsroller-grinder.com to discover how RMS can transform your brewing experience. Unleash the full potential of your grains with RMS Roller Grinder, the trusted choice of brewers worldwide. So let's talk about fermentation in craft lager. How do you do it? What's the process behind it? Obviously, you've mentioned fast.
Yeah.
So in order to get a reasonably dry beer, I don't know what your finishing gravity is on this, but with 2 row and a decent mash, you can get a pretty full attenuation. How do you proceed through that?
I mean, with any lager brewing, you're going to want a higher pitch rate. So starting with the cell load you need, but, it's the yeast strain we're using. I think it was maybe a little hush hush, but I don't care anymore about that. But we're using a high pressure lager strain that's become more popular these days.
Okay.
And what that does, this strain can ferment at about 15 PSI. Okay. And that keeps esters down. And so you can ferment much warmer than you would with a traditional strain. So that's very different than when
I had this. We were just writing about pressure fermentation for the Brewing Industry Guide. Yeah. And searching for some sources on this. Man, if I had only known. Interesting.
Yeah. So that's key to fermenting quickly, right? Because you
let the fermentation build its own pressure then as it starts fermenting, and then leave it there.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, it'll build it pretty quickly as it's going. And this is very different from when we're making some stuff on a smaller scale and we're using traditional strains that you definitely don't want to do that to because they are not adapted to that pressure. But yeah,
it keeps also mean a warmer fermentation temperature then too, or
yeah, it is, and it's like maybe what cold IPA brewers say they ferment at now, and they're fermenting warm, and we're like, well, it's kind of the normal one, but yeah, it's more like in the low 60s rather than in the 50s or lower even. So that will speed up your fermentation. One thing that you do need to be mindful of with that is sulfur compounds. I think you mentioned that earlier. So you're blowing off a lot of hydrogen sulfide in a lager fermentation like that. And if you're capping it under pressure, it's harder for some of that to volatilize. So you need to make sure you have a vigorous fermentation and then still give it some time for cold conditioning. I know I'm saying you can do it quickly, but it does need some lagering, just not as long as you would traditionally do.
Do you do anything, while it's still in that fermentation tank, whether it's, bubbling or bursting, CO2 through the tank or temporarily depressurizing and repressurizing?
Nope, just let it do its thing. Yeah, that yeast is really adapted to that high pressure. So that also helps it with flocculation. So we need to crop yeast off of that quite a bit. So with that pressure, when it's done, and we can get a good crop off of the tank. It's just like making sure you've got healthy yeast. Obviously, I'm sure everyone harps on that, but getting your cell load right. And then, with craft lager being all malt, that helps a lot because you've got enough free amino nitrogen in there. And if you're deficient in that, that's where you can get some really bad sulfur problems. So, when we're making stuff with more adjuncts, you might need to supplement that in another form.
Interesting. Is there anything else to kind of maintain that yeast health through this, high pressure environment?
For sure. You want to crop that yeast as soon as you can because it's not a good, we are using cylinder conical vessels. So you already have a lot of hydrostatic pressure at the bottom of the tank there. So you want to get that yeast off as soon as you can. We don't have, a way to crop that or we're not propping up yeast in another vessel. So we're kind of doing a cone to cone type method. So you don't want to leave it on there too long because once it's done, it can be very stressed out under that amount of pressure. The key is to definitely take it off as soon as it's ready so that you can keep that going into subsequent generations.
How do you measure when it's ready? Because I imagine the fermentation on this is much quicker than a normal lager fermentation. And at that point, even missing it by one day can be pretty significant in terms of excessive contact time.
It's just like anything with experience, you kind of know when that sweet spot is. We're generally seeing after a couple weeks, it'll start to flocculate out. You want to make sure your solids are high enough for the next pitch, but that's when that kind of intersection of viability and percent solids is where you want it. So I'd say it's an experience thing, knowing when we can crop it, because I got to build that schedule out and make sure it's lined up for the next brew. But, and then it's just standard lab analysis of, looking at your viability and cell count and all of that. It's inherently a stressful environment for yeast, even one that's adapted to it. So it's just trying to get it in and out as quick as we can, pretty much.
Was this you're using this process in 2019 with that silver medal winning? Yep. Pressure fermentation. Silver medal and, GABF Pilsner, International Pilsner. Interesting. Are there any concerns, after that point in terms of how long then do you, after primary fermentation is done, do you let it sit in condition or lager?
You want a few weeks if you can.
Sure.
But that's, sometimes you need to do a little earlier.
Sure.
You're giving it at least a week or two, which is pretty standard for ales. But, with this kind of lager, kind of what we found also is if you can step it down, you might not crash it down to freezing right away, but maybe down to more of what we call a cellar temp, which is, I talk in Celsius, it's 5C, it's maybe 40 Fahrenheit. And that'll help that yeast flocculate a bit so you can remove it and then go into more of a traditional lagering temperature and cold conditioning that's closer to freezing. As long as you get a week or two, it's usually pretty good. I think that, if we just hit all of our benchmarks, we've done this so much that it generally behaves, but there's some times where you definitely need to kind of monitor things and try to make some tweaks to, accommodate the yeast and how it's fermenting. So
sure, it's interesting from a sensory standpoint. How do you all describe the flavor then of craft lager when all is said and brewed?
Yeah. That's a good question.
You have to have a standard for this, right? Like,
Yeah,
what is the
for
beer
sure.
and what are we trying to hit?
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly more yeast character from this fermentation than when we make, some of these more traditional lager brewing methods. Like,
Right.
those are generally very neutral. With craft lager, there is always a touch of sulfur, but for me, it's at the level
great.
that's, yeah. Well, you need the right amount, right?
Sure,
when it gets too high, it's not good.
Sure.
But there's a touch of that. There is, I don't know if it's quite an ester, but it's got this light fruitiness to it. I would describe it kind of like how Kolsch can be.
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, this is clean, but it's got something going on there. So it adds some complexity. It's not like very clean and neutral. It's got something else going on. It's kind of hard to describe, but when you taste it multiple times a week for years, you're like, that's that, so what's going on there. And then also like how the malt presents itself. So you want the right level of attenuation. You don't want to over attenuate, even though I really like dry lagers. You want a little malt backbone there.
Yeah.
And
what do you strive for in finishing gravity?
We're generally about 2 Plato there.
Okay.
So, nothing crazy, but it's still, it's not really sweet or anything.
Right.
But the best batches, are when you've got that balance of everything where it's the hops and, the fermentation character is kind of synergistic with that malt. Like I think the sulfur can kind of complement that malt a little bit, but like I said, it has to be very light because some people are very sensitive.
It's a great structuring element if you're not structuring with bitterness.
Yeah.
And again, keeps it from just feeling flat.
Yeah.
In the mouth. It's such a interesting kind of like aroma character that actually gives you the idea of structure without that kind of bitter flavor.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be as afraid of sulfur as some people are.
It's a part of fermentation. This is how yeast cells, redox balance. This is part of it. So,
as Stan Hieronymus once said to me, it's like that perfect match, the perfect strike of a match. I love it. Let's talk about some of the other lagers that you all brew. Before we do that, you like wildly aromatic IPAs and tropical lagers? Good thing Omega designed thiolized yeast for just that reason. Thiolized yeast are a new tool for brewers to bring intense guava and passion fruit aromas out of your malt and hops. And wait, there's more. Omega yeast makes yeast to order with a consistent 1-week lead time, ensuring peak freshness and reliability. Also, sustainability doesn't have to cost you more. Try Robert's Polypros multi-pack can handles designed for sustainability and for cost savings. Grip pack rings are biodegradable and average 5 cents per unit. Craft pack carriers are recyclable and designed with 30% less plastic. Plus, you can save up to 25% on costs. Enjoy easy application with inline applicators and 24/7 support. It's easy to go green with these multi-pack handles. Visit go.robertspolypro.com/CBBpod to request free samples and start saving today. And ABS Commercial's been a full-service brewery outfitter for over 10 years. They're proud to offer brew houses, tanks, keg washers, and small parts to brewers across the country, as well as equipment for distilling, cider making, wine making, and more. They know the ins and outs of the brewing and installation process and can design the perfect setup for you, whether you're just starting out or looking to expand. Contact them today at sales@abs-commercial.com to discuss your customized brewery needs. ABS Commercial, we are brewers. So talk to me about some of the lagers you might make in more traditional ways. Some regularly find their way into your lineup, or at least on a seasonal basis. It seems like you guys have definitely stretched out in that regard.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier I was doing the R&D work over here for a number of years, and that's kind of when I fell in love with lager. So I was making a lot of those, and I think some of my favorite are like Munich Helles, Czech Dark Lager. Those are 2 awesome ones there. But the difference there being maybe more complex mashing methods, trying to coax a little flavor out of these more premium Pilsner malts.
You guys decoct over here on this system?
I call it kind of a modified decoction. We don't have the system set up to truly pump the mash over and decoct it, but I can decoct wort over and kind of hit different mash rests. And this is a direct fire kettle over here. So this thing was put together back in 2008 when they're scrapping things together, and it's still kicking. And one thing I do like about the direct fire is you get some really cool Maillard reaction from that. So when you extend your boils there, you get some really nice maltiness out of it. But I mean, the biggest thing I think in traditional lager brewing is how you're using that yeast, right? And fermenting much cooler, pitching higher. I've fermented down at probably like 5 Celsius before 440 Fahrenheit. So, much cooler fermentation, obviously not under pressure, using a spunding valve for some natural carbonation. So some of the stuff that, is catching back on in the craft world. I love experimenting with that, but, like I said, also taking some more contemporary methods, to brewing beer. And, one of those is like our Japanese style rice lager, that you're drinking right there. That's a new year-round offering, and we can make that at scale. Using exogenous enzymes, that's another thing that if you're a traditional Reinheitsgebot brewer, you're not doing that, but I don't care at all. I'll do it, whatever makes the beer better.
Sure. So talk to me about this Japanese Japanese style rice lager.
Yeah. So that's
what's the process behind this, and where do you start?
Yeah. We've made this for a number of years. It's been in the tap room, and then it just kind of got popularity. So we started making it on the large scale, and really what it is,
lighter and lighter and lighter lagers that seem to be catching on.
Yeah.
Oh, this one's light. It's not, it's not neutral or flavorless.
Exactly.
Like it still has, some flavor to it, even though it is very light. And, as these mostly empty glasses are proving, still a solid amount of lacing and, head, and some of the technical pieces are all there from what you expect out of a lager.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, this is inspired by, those Japanese rice lagers like Asahi Super Dry.
Yeah.
So the idea is that, there's more flaked rice in this than malted barley.
Really?
So it is a really, really high percentage of rice. It gives it that pale color. And, you mentioned it's not entirely
what kind
neutral.
of percentage of rice?
It's probably like 55%.
Wow. Okay.
So, I'll get into it in a little bit, but that presents some challenges as well.
Yes, it does.
But the flaked rice is the reason you're not just getting a really, really neutral beer. If you use rice syrup or solids, or even if you were to use a cereal cooker and use rice straight up, you're going to get a very neutral beer. And we've seen that in some pilots where it's like, okay, this is fine, but it's starting to taste more like your run-of-the-mill light lager, right? And that flaked rice adds a lot of character. It also is easier to use if you don't have a cereal cooker, right? Flaked rice is a torrefied flaked product, so you can use it in like a single infusion mash. And I've also noticed that it does improve foam, which was counterintuitive to what I thought would happen with a product that has lower protein. But for whatever reason, and maybe I need to talk to Crisp Malting about this a little bit, but it does seem to improve foam stability and the structure a bit. A lot of flaked rice. In the mashing, we're using exogenous enzymes.
Yeah.
So like the glucoamylase that was big in brute IPAs, that's going in the mash so that we can control the sugar spectrum we're getting out of that infusion. And that allows it to dry out a lot when we ferment it. And then, the hops are also a big thing. This is not just using, like a noble type or something like that. This is using Contessa hops, which are a new variety from Hopsteiner.
Right.
We were using them when they were, the experimental 04190, but really like them in lagers. It's kind of cool to see hop development in the US go towards more lager geared hops instead of just the crazy new IPA hop. But I really enjoy it because it has some cool kind of green tea and like pear notes to it that I think complement the rice really well. But fermentation is a little different when you're using such a high percentage of flaked rice. I mentioned FAN earlier. The aminos that are in this beer are much lower because we're using so much rice.
Yeah.
So we do need to supplement that a bit, or else you can get, sulfur issues and all that. So it's, learning how to work with what the yeast needs, and using such a high percentage of rice is, a little atypical. So kind of working around those parameters to make
Are there certain nutrients that you lean on to make sure that the fermentation proceeds in a healthy way. And is this the same kind of pressure fermentation? Or?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
So, it's really just inorganic nitrogen is really important. But just getting your yeast assimilable nitrogen up to a level that it would be with a 100% malted barley beer. That was one thing that we learned a lot from seltzer production is, how luckily we are.
Seltzer production? There's an upside to it?
Well, you learn like how blessed you are as a brewer to have malted barley as your sugar source, because you do get that full spectrum of amino acids that you do not have when you're just adding sugar. So learning that helped a lot in a beer that was maybe a little deficient in yan. So yeah.
Amazing to watch the reverberations of seltzer through other beer styles. That's interesting. When it comes to the hops, like how, is there, again, using an IBU, these are not like, the goal is not hoppiness out of this beer. The goal is subtle flavor and aroma. Yeah. And complementary to, again, those rice flavors that you mentioned. Yeah. Is there a hopping rate or amount that you strive for that, that's enough, but not too much?
I think it's about a pound per barrel there. So it's pretty light, but
is that all Whirlpool added then too, or?
That's a Whirlpool as well.
Okay.
And we keep bitterness down on this because it's so dry. It doesn't need it as much. And, just it'll finish out like close to it, definitely below 1 Plato. So it's
really?
Very dry.
But that's primarily the enzyme that's driving the extra lift, on the fermentation there.
Yeah, but we're kind of locked in. Like if you added that enzyme to a tank, it would just keep going and it would go until there's no sugar left. This is only in the mash. So we only, it's only acting for a little bit of time, but it does dry it out just a little bit more. And we don't have to worry about that enzyme remaining active into other processes, right?
Right.
Because it'll get denatured in the boil. But just using that to kind of hone in on that dryness that we're looking for, nice and crisp without, a ton of hot bitterness. It's just like, again, another very easy drinking beer. This is one that, like, as brewers, we would drink it all the time when it's 95 out and you just want something really refreshing.
Right. Now, I'm going to assume that this also uses 2-row barley as, on the other.
Yeah, 2-row, but rice, again, being the majority. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
And do you do anything special with the water in either of these lagers?
In craft lager, we do not, other than acidification for, mash pH and sparge and whatnot. But for this one, I believe we do kind of a balanced profile. We do bump up calcium a little bit. So we're kind of having a balanced chloride to sulfate ratio on this. But, bumping up calcium a little bit, mainly for yeast health and clarity, because we want a really clear beer out of this one.
If you're thinking about, some of the real difference makers when it comes to making lagers with yeast under pressure and fermenting in a cylindroconical and all of this, these processes that are more common for American craft brewers, but maybe less common in the lager world. What do you think, what are the things that brewers out there listening should pay the most attention to in their either recipe design or technical process?
I mean, it's always going to be the yeast. So, what you can only control so much on the front end, but, making sure that your yeast has the nutrients that it needs, especially when you're using high adjunct percentages. But then, doing stuff like dumping trub off early. We don't have a float tank like German lager brewers do, but making sure you're getting some of that cold break off, not too many lipids in there. But just making sure you're starting with a healthy firm there, because, if you start with subpar yeast, it doesn't matter what you do. And always just kind of monitoring and tweaking to make sure that the yeast is happy, for sure.
Sure. Well, let's change gears and let's talk about, because we're here in the Lee Hill Brewery and we're surrounded by wood barrels, and you've spent 5 years on these kinds of experimental projects and trying to brew interesting beers with solid stories that connect with consumers here. Let's talk about, 1 or 2 or 3 of your favorite projects and, some of those things that you started with a vision for and then, saw to fruition as the final beers.
Sure.
What comes to mind initially?
Well, we're talking about fermentation. That immediately leads to one project because it's challenging in that regard. But I think our Grand Reserve that we released a couple years ago was a really cool project to see to fruition. It's a big barrel-aged beer that was aged for 4 years. It's 21% ABV. So there's a lot of learning about how to make high gravity beer to make that happen. And that started as like our 1,000th batch. We're, maybe in our 2,500, something like that now.
Yeah.
So it was definitely years ago, and we wanted to make, a big beer, age it in bourbon barrels, and then we had some left over. This was kind of when I was starting over here. And it's like, well, what do we do with some of the leftover, barrel-aged beer? Well, let's double barrel age it, right? Like that's not anything new there, but it's like, let's age it for a long time too. That was something that was in my head. I had tried, Tawny Port or Pedro Jimenez Sherry and some of these oxidized wines and fortified wines, and like, hey, can you make something like that with beer? So the Grand Reserve, aged for about 4 years in 2 different barrels, and it's served intentionally still. So it's like, it's got all this really interesting oxidative character, but to get to that high ABV without it tasting terrible, you need to learn how to coax yeast to make that much alcohol. And, some of that alcohol is coming from aging in a barrel for 4 years. But a lot of it is on the front end in fermentation, getting up towards 18% alcohol. And I'm not a huge seltzer drinker, but I learned a ton about fermentation from making that stuff. And making sure that, you're getting the yeast load that you need, and then providing it with additional nutrients as it starts to deplete those, using enzymes when we need to, like that glucoamylase in barrel-aged beer is actually very effective. It won't dry out all the way because the yeast will, be finished before it can even get there. But that's
always been Avery's trick, right?
Yeah,
since we're talking about Boulder right here, their high ABV beers were always enzyme driven back in the day. They brew far fewer of those now than they may have 10 years ago.
Yep.
But I remember they used to call it the liquid Schwartz or something like that. It's a big secret.
Yeah, but you definitely want to add that later on.
Everyone's in the secret now. Let's talk about Grand Reserve. What was the idea? You mentioned it's a barrel aged beer, but what was the flavor goal for this? And, how would you describe the beer now? Not that there's some description for an 18 to 21% beer that exists out there in the modern world, but is there a corollary to it? This, I assume it wasn't a stout necessarily.
No.
So what were you hoping to achieve in terms of flavor you ended up with? And how did you then build a recipe that was going to get you to 1, the ABV you needed, 2, the flavor you needed, 3, get you through long years of aging, and so that it would develop in a pleasing way and not end up being something that just couldn't make the trip.
Yeah.
I love that phrase, by the way. Couldn't make the trip. That one comes from the Van Winkle family. That's I read the book Pappyland.
Yeah,
and they talk about how some beer, some bottles just don't make the trip.
Yeah, didn't make the cut.
Yeah.
Well, like if I had to assign a style category to it, it's probably closest to a barley wine, right? Okay. You're starting with pretty.
And we don't have to think strictly within those.
Well, that's where we depart. So it's you think a big malty beer, but no roast character, right? So pretty simple. Maybe it's so many years ago now. I think we probably use Maris Otter or something like that. But a pretty stout. Well, not in a stout, but burley wort there. And, then we're feeding it with different sugars. So
what was your initial, what gravity did you brew to?
Yeah. We probably only brewed to like 20 Plato.
Oh, okay.
And the reason for that is like, if you start to go too high there, your osmotic stress is just going to kill the yeast. So you need to start where it's still comfortable.
Same strategy that the brewery in Placentia, California, has. We've written about it in the magazine and talked about it with them too. That brewing lower and then feeding kind of process.
Yeah. So fed batch. That's what we're talking about there. We used a bunch of different sugars, mainly just because we could. But like unrefined sugars like turbinado or muscovado. Dark muscovado is a favorite of mine for these because it leaves a really cool note behind, like kind of rummy. But feeding it sugar as it's going along, especially early on, giving it more oxygen for yeast cell growth. But then, once you get the biomass you need, cutting that off, because we want to make alcohol and not just yeast growth. So cutting that off and then providing the nutrients it needs as you're only feeding it sugar again,
right.
and it's not getting the free amino nitrogen it needs. So just kind of bumping that up.
Those yeasts can also, get lazy.
Yeah.
You're giving them such easy stuff to eat.
Yeah.
They get happy and they just, it's easy to stall out and have a lot of unfermented wort. How do you keep them working but also happy?
Well, so you get enough yeast there that's, vital and ready to go. And
how much is enough?
Enough, like a lot. Let's see. I mean, I would shoot for at least, let's say 200 million cells per mil per degree Plato or something like huge. Like we're just trying to prop up as much as we can, because you're just trying to get that momentum to carry it through. And then you're giving it, the sugar and yeast nutrients are super important, because like without that, they're just gonna, they're like, they have the sugar, but they don't have the aminos that they need to continue fermentation. So that's crucial. And then you're just kind of letting it go.
Yeah, what's the pace of feeding look like on that? Are you watching, are you measuring and feeding when it drops a certain number of Plato, or is there a time, or is there some other measure that you use for it?
Yeah, we're taking dailies and measuring pH and Plato every day, and when we're seeing it generally between like 10 to 12 Plato, I'll feed it again, because you don't want to like let it get too far gone there, but like kind of that middle ground, and you just kind of keep feeding it, and it takes a little more, and you keep feeding it, and then you'll start to see kind of an inflection point. And especially if like you have an alkalizer and you're like, oh, we're getting up there, like it's in a stressful environment.
Right.
There's a lot of metabolites there that the yeast is not happy with. So you might kind of be a little more cautious with your next feeding, but like, I don't know, it's kind of weird. I always call it the like foie gras of beer making, because you're just feeding it until it can't do it anymore. But within reason, right? Like you're not going to just keep going and then it just stalls out. Like, okay, it's like the fermentation data will tell you like it's starting to slow down. We're not going to force it with more sugar. It's like, let's let this ride out and attenuate as far as it can. Because, often with that, if you're measuring gravity, it's going to look really low, but there's still a lot of sugar left, right? Because there's a lot of alcohol in there. Yeah. It's less dense, so it's throwing off your density reading a bit. But yeah, it's just kind of finding that sweet spot, and knowing that you're not going to like just force it to be, because we're not trying to make the highest gravity thing possible necessarily. It's just knowing like, kind of shooting for a certain spot and having some intentionality behind that. And then, the rest of the beer where it's like, okay, does it make sense to age it for 4 years? Well, if you're trying to get oxidative character, sure. We have all these sugars that we've been feeding it. There's a ton of these Meyer products from these long boils we're doing on it. And over time, those oxidize, you get these nice aldehyde notes that are kind of that nutty almond character, honey, and then that classic sherry oxidation. So you're just kind of giving it time in the barrel. There's some other brewers that have experimented with more of like a macro oxidation method,
sure.
Like is popular in Madeira. We were just kind of like, this is so high in ABV, it's not going to spoil. What's funny is like we could, run PCR on the barrels and be like, there is stuff in here, but it did not survive and it was not able to ferment anything. So you're just kind of letting it hang out and age through the seasons in Colorado. It's so arid here. You see quite a bit of ABV increase over time because it just evaporates off. Yeah.
Even through the barrel.
Yeah. And so just giving it that time to just oxidize and develop and become this cool thing. That's why I wanted to serve it still, is that it was just very akin to that like tawny port, and just having that kind of like caramelized stone fruit, dried fruit with that almond honey note. Just something that you would, sip a little bit after dinner as a dessert or something like that.
Right. What other, you mentioned probably a base of Maris Otter, but what other layered malts, do you throw in there, for character and, and some of those additional levels of depth and interest?
I mean, honestly, if you're going for above 20%, you want to keep the specialty malt to a minimum, especially roasted malt, because that's only going to affect your yeast.
Yeah.
And you'll get a ton of character from, especially if you're feeding it unrefined sugars. And then the barrels are really important. Like I think barrel choice is also paramount there. But, you know, if you're going a little lower, the classics, you know, like I really like DRC is like a double roasted caramel malt. You know, just some things there. But honestly, you keep it really simple on these high gravity ones, because like I mentioned, with that sugar you're adding, you get a ton of character there. It's weird. That's what I'm saying. It's not like a normal beer. It's like there's malt to start, but then you're feeding it sugar and you're like barrel aging it forever, and you're really boosting this high alcohol product. And it's something kind of unique, and it comes off. We always called it like barley port, because it's just like, yeah, I guess it's beer. Like it kind of tastes like some of our other barrel aged beers, but it's got something very unique to it.
Interesting. And so what do you ferment with?
That has changed over time, but you know, there's some classic strains for high gravity, and we typically don't use those. So
really,
there's some diastaticus positive strains like these. I forget the Saison strain that a lot of people use. I know River North has used those, and they make great stuff at high ABV. But like for the Grand Reserve, it was just like a classic Abbey Belgian strain actually, which was really weird because, you know, when the beer was young, it had the Belgian character to it. And it kind of had this Bananas Foster vibe, right? Because it had the esters and then that kind of caramely. But over time, the esters faded away and you don't really get that as much anymore. A lot of the big stouts and stuff that we do more like a dry English strain. So I think yeast strain is important. You need something that's ethanol tolerant, but there's no, you know, I think as long as you can treat it right, you can get pretty, you know, robust beers with a number of different strains.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Anything to kind of, you know, temperature and process on that? I mean, we talked about timing, and that's just really a measure, you know, just measuring it. Is there a temperature range where you're going to keep it happy and not overstressed?
Yeah, you definitely want to start cooler, because if you start really warm, you're getting more of those fusel alcohols, that harsh note. I definitely would let it warm up towards the end of fermentation. That helps it kind of attenuate and finish out. But if you can keep it cooler, I think we probably start around 18 Celsius. That's, you know, mid 60s or something like that. And then let it kind of free rise towards the end, maybe after you're done feeding to just finish out. But you definitely want to start a bit low, because otherwise, you know, depending on the yeast strain you have, you might get more esters than you want. I mean, this is all redox balanced fermentation stuff. So you just want to keep it tame and try to keep things kind of keep it tight, but, you know, let it do its thing.
Yeah. How do you manage, you know, now, of course, the fraction of this went into barrels, you said, for 4 years.
Yeah.
That's a long ass time.
It is.
In some barrels.
Yeah.
We're sitting here. It's the middle of the summer. It's pretty warm in here. You know, it's 90 something, probably 95 degree high out, right?
Yeah.
You know, today. You know, and this is not a temperature controlled barrel room. And, you know, on the flip side, in the middle of winter, this is going to be relatively cold back here. Obviously got heaters in here, but, you know, it's not kept to one consistent temperature or anything. There's definitely some swings, potentially some wide swings in temperature over the seasons.
Yeah.
You know, how do you manage that oxidation, you know, that expansion and contraction of liquid in and out of the wood over those seasons as those temperatures change? You know, do you top up barrels? Do you take any other strategies, you know, to try to, you know, massage the way that these oxidize?
Yeah, I mean, with most of our like barrel aged stouts or a normal kind of level, that's maybe not 20%. That's a huge thing. Like, you know, we don't leave it in there nearly that long. It may be 6 months to a year. Yeah. Because we get, you know, it's so arid here, you get a lot of action through the wood. But these beers that are designed to be super high ABV, they can take on a lot of the tannins, you know, the polyphenols from the oak. So we kind of want that. It's like, you know, the rack houses in Kentucky, they get very cold in the winter and very hot in the summer. So we want a lot of that expansion and contraction to extract all that flavor from the wood. So it's kind of nice to do these huge beers because you're not as concerned about that. And then topping up, we don't want to do, because we want more, you know, as it evaporates, we're going to get more surface area on, you know, the top of the liquid there for oxidation. And we're we're trying to oxidize it, but like, it's still pretty slow, right? It's not like bubbling O2 through the beer, which is another, great strategy, but it's different. So we're just kind of letting it do its thing. You're obviously losing quite a bit of angel share there, but when you're just trying to do a small volume of something that's really cool, that's how we let it go. And, you definitely see quite a bit of loss over that time. But
how much loss out of a barrel on a percentage kind of basis?
I mean, the lowest barrel I saw maybe was like 60%. Full.
Wow.
Yeah. So but that's condensed down. That's intense flavor there.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, we lost it, but that's how you make that without, that's how you're concentrating it down. But yeah.
21%. So no, didn't end up with any sour barrels out of those.
No, not at all.
Yeah. Cool. All right, is there another project in addition to the Grand Reserve that you found you really learned things through the process of making it?
Yeah, kind of on the other side, but still barrel aging is our open space terroir project that we released in June of this year. And that was something that I started again 4 years ago. Just kind of experimentation, like, all right, what's going to happen here? So getting really obviously very inspired by Lambic Brewing and Goose from Belgium, not having a cool ship here. So we couldn't make traditional spontaneous beer, but wanting to kind of replicate a process that would capture some of that locality of where we are. And I remember reading on Jester King's blog years ago about how they had kind of captured some microbes from plants that were around them. And it's like, well, maybe we can try that. And this is just like a one-off project kind of thing. Like we'll see what happens. So basically just went around the brewery and foraged some plants and made a little 5-gallon starter. And within a week it was fermenting. And then it's like, well, okay, like maybe we can make a beer with this starter. So then you're kind of, taking a page out of the Lambic Brewer's book. You're making as dextrinous a wort as possible with unmalted wheat, 60% unmalted wheat and 40% malted barley, using the aged hops. So kind of replicating that wort profile and then knocking it out into steamed neutral oak barrels and inoculating it with that starter that you made weeks prior. So, I call that wild inoculation or something. It's not spontaneous, but it's not using a pure culture of any form, like some of the mixed culture stuff we have in our fruiters here.
Right.
And then just kind of seeing how that goes.
So on this, like how long of a process did that take? Because if I'm thinking about it from a brewery perspective, I'm not going to brew a 10-barrel batch of a crazy dextrinous wort and then just hope that this thing that does appear to be fermenting will actually ferment all of that. There has to be more of an evaluation process,
sure.
And therefore you had to, start with a wort that and then be able to see how that's what that culture is then now going to do to that. And does that produce pleasant aromas and flavors? Does that produce unpleasant? Is it producing things we don't want at all, in a fermentation process? Because all of those are potential outcomes. And before you go risk the time and expense of making a big batch.
I mean, it starts as a passion project in the unknown, honestly. Like, I was very fortunate. Lee Hill is sort of our playground. It's the test ground. So it's like, Matt Cutter, our founder, is like, if you're not dumping beer, you're not trying hard enough. So it's like, let's try some weird stuff. No one really knew that this was going on except for a few people. But it's like that first year, we have a 7-barrel system that'll fill about 4 oak barrels. And it's like, okay, the barrels are fermenting. I'm seeing a primary fermentation. It smells kind of like a wild wit beer or something. It's got that spicy phenol character. We'll see how that ages. And then, the following spring, I was doing this all in the spring. It's like, oh, those are kind of coming along. Okay, well, let's make another one. And, in the tradition of Goose, you have multiple years that you're blending together. So it's like, let's do another round of that. And knowing that not all of them will be good. So
sure.
You do need a decent amount of stock because, you look at each barrel, it's its own fermentation. And, once I had 3 years of that, then I had all these different qualities that were, pretty cool. And some of them, it was very apparent right off the bat. It's like, this either A, isn't ready, or B, I'm going to dump this. This is not good. And you hear that a lot from spontaneous fermentation, except for maybe the people that are really good at it, that, yeah, you're not going to get all good winners out of that. And then you're just blending for the qualities that you like in each barrel and bottling it and letting it condition for another year. And, and then you have your finished product that I think turned out great. And so it kind of started with, curiosity. I think that's a big thing in brewing, is like leaning into curiosity and trying to learn something new, try something new, and then just seeing how things turn out. And, I'm fortunate to have people that were backing that up.
For sure. Let's zoom out a little bit here, as we come to the end. You've been at it now 10 years with Upslope. It's been the entirety of your brewing career. You've gotten to play a lot. Now you're, maybe in a more disciplined role as head brewer. Within your career, what do you want to achieve next? And what is on the near-term and long-term horizon for Upslope?
Man, that's a tough one. But, I think you're seeing it right. I'm now in more of a role that's a bit more disciplined, or, I'm looking at different things than I was when I'm playing around here. But, I do think I'm leaning back on my background, in engineering and in efficiencies, and that's fun, right? Like making things better and more efficient on a brewing scale, but also just like cost effectiveness. It's a tough market out there now. We're very saturated. But so it's very important to continue to innovate. So it's like we can stick to our guns, but with over 9,000 breweries out there, you got to keep coming up with something new. And so I think that's always a fun challenge.
That innovation, quality, and efficiency all working, in this kind of concert becomes then the magical space. It's not just one of those. You kind of have to work on all three of those.
Yeah. And, I don't know necessarily what the future for me or Upslope is and where that needs to go. I do think that, right now there's a bit of a leveling off in the industry, and it's pretty tough out there, to be honest. There's a lot of breweries that are having to make some tough calls, but I think, being able to be thrifty and kind of figure out how to make things work and like I said, continuing to come up with new stuff that people want to try is great. And a lot of that is just sticking to, what you're passionate about. Cause you can tell, I think you mentioned earlier, it's like you can tell when someone's passionate about something rather than just like, hey, we're putting this out there cause we think we should. That was a big move for like the push to our international lager series that we have now. I was like, all of us brewers like making these and drinking these. And I think that people are kind of catching on to that. So we made a big push in that direction, and we're seeing, positive reception there. So I'm hoping that there's, beer has a lot of staying power. We've mentioned seltzer. It had a big, popular moment there, but I don't know if it'll be around like craft beer does. We've got, we've got the culture behind it, the history, beer, I think will weather the storm and we'll be there with it. So yeah, it's tough to know, but just kind of staying true to what you like to do, I think is super important.
I think you're right. And I think you can certainly taste the passion in the beers that the brewers make when they're making those things that they really care about.
Yep.
And that's a great place to bring it to a close. G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, and reliability with 24/7 service and support. Gambrinus Malting combines European-influenced malting practices with the finest barley, wheat, and rye. Try Old Orchard's flavored craft juice concentrate blends in your next craft beverage. AccuBrew helps you detect problems before they ruin a batch. ProBrew has rotary can fillers in stock with a 2 to 4 week lead time. RMS roller grinder mills unlock the full potential of your grain. Omega stylized yeasts bring intense guava and passion fruit aromas out of your malt and hops. Go green with multi-pack handles from Robert's Polypro. And ABS Commercial is your full-service brewery outfitter. If you've enjoyed this podcast and any others, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button, and become a subscriber to Craft Beer and Brewing. We're getting into our best in beer season, and so if you're a member of our email list, and if you're not, you should go sign up on beerandbrewing.com. We will send out to that email list a link for voting in our best in beer over this next week. We hope you all go and vote. Let your listener voices be heard, and tell us what your favorite breweries, beers, styles, and whatnot were from 2023. Get out there and do it. We want to see what you all think. Alex, if people want to learn more about Upslope, where do they find you all?
Yeah, you can go to our website, upslopebrewing.com, or, any of the social areas like Twitter and especially Instagram at Upslope. You can find it pretty easy.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for talking to me about lager brewing, high gravity brewing, and all of these things. It's been fun to get back here to this Lee Hill Brewery, and harken back to my early days of craft beer and brewing. Cheers.
Thanks for having me on, man.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.